Hello and welcome back to Conversations in Sustainability, your monthly podcast tackling the biggest environmental and social impact issues shaping Australia. I'm your host, Alice Johnson, and in this episode we're chatting about a brand behind some of Australia's most iconic chocky brands. Whether you're a Kit Kat superfan or just prefer your Milo straight out of the tin, chances are you know and love a Nestlé product or two. Today, it's my pleasure to be joined by Nestlé's Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability, Margaret Stuart. Welcome, Margaret.
Hi, great to be here.
So, when I was planning for this podcast, the issue I had was, where on earth do you start?
That's my problem every day.
Yeah.
Every day.
So you've got a huge number of brands. You're operating in multiple territories. You're touching on such a huge range of issues, whether it's the water, the climate impact, sustainable sourcing, waste reduction, circularity. Where do you start? How do you prioritise when you're sitting down to approach sustainability at Nestlé?
Well, sometimes I feel it's like that thing, how do you eat an elephant one mouthful at a time?
Yep.
We started really from the point of view of going, where are the opportunities that we can start on first? And one of the joys of having a large organisation is that you do have people that specialise in things. So you have people that specialise in packaging. You have people that run factories. You have people that do a range of different things. So not everybody does everything, but everything still must be done. And so we start by having really firm targets in place, because one thing that we know about business responds really well to a good set of targets. And so we have targets in place and we put plans in place to get those things done. We have them for each year and we have them rolling out into the future as well. So that we know where we're going and we track those things really regularly to make sure that we're just delivering what we have committed to.
So let's talk about one of the areas where I imagine you've got some pretty scary, hairy targets around the climate reporting side of things. So Green Horizon did a report at the start of this year where we asked sustainability leaders about, what are the issues that keep them up at night? What are they worrying about? And just overwhelmingly, their answer was climate reporting and the impact of Scope 3. We know it's coming down the pipeline like a steam train for a lot of big corporates. Where are you guys at on the Scope 3 journey? How are you measuring? Because your supply chain must be incredibly expensive.
So we started on our Scope 3 journey a few years ago when we launched our SBTI-aligned climate roadmap. That has about 2/3 of our Scope 3 emissions come from agriculture. We have targets to reduce our emissions by 20% by 2025 on our 2018 baseline, 50% by 2030, and then net zero by 2050. So 2050 sounds like a long time away, but I'm telling you right now, 2025 is not. And so the need to engage with our supply chain has been really key from day one. And because it's agriculture, that's predominantly farmers. We often don't engage directly with farmers. It's with suppliers who might be a midpoint in between. But we're working really solidly at how we reduce that. A lot of our emissions in our direct control, things like renewable electricity in our factories. It's funny, when we reached 100% renewable electricity in Australia, it felt like it had been quite a hard project. But with the benefit of hindsight, it now feels like low-hanging fruit compared to the challenges of agriculture. But we're working on how do we engage with farming to improve regenerative agriculture practices and improve farming practices so that what happens on farm, bearing in mind that agriculture is not just important to us, but agriculture is 25-30% of the world's global emissions. How do we make a difference there? One area that's been particularly key for me working in Oceania is dairy in New Zealand. New Zealand is an enormous producer of dairy and Nestlé buys a lot of it. In fact, we're Fonterra's biggest customer and Fonterra takes by far the bulk of New Zealand's dairy. So the question for us is, if we are to reduce our emissions, how do we work with dairy farmers to do that? The answer is not. The answer is never to go to farmers and say, here, just do this for us. Because it's high level of risk for farmers, and it's just plain not fair to throw the problem at their feet.
It's a really interesting point, the fairness element of it, isn't it? Because there's a lot of discussion about how does the farming community improve their sustainability, but should they be bearing the cost, the impact of that, given how tight they are squeezed. They're on the front lines of climate change. They're experiencing really tough conditions financially. So how do you level that playing field?
So the reality for a lot of farmers, and I'm talking cropping here now, is that it's one crop a year, one investment a year, one payback a year. And so to throw the problem at their feet is completely unfair. And why should they carry all the costs of transitioning to a low carbon economy? They just shouldn't. And so the concept of just transition means that it needs to be fair for everybody. So if I look at what we're doing in dairy in New Zealand, for example, we're funding farmers who are supplying us to help them through that transition. We're supplying them with equipment and research and trees and all sorts of other things to make sure to help them make that transition on their own farms. In reality, what we would expect for some farmers is a short-term dip over a few years while they transition, and then a restoration to a more normal production. And it's entirely appropriate that we support them through that transition, and that's what we're doing.
Absolutely. And I imagine a lot of the solutions that we need for your farmers, across your other suppliers, and for your own business, sometimes they don't even exist yet. I'm curious about innovation. So
innovation is really, really critical, because you're right. Some of the things that will take us to 2050, we don't yet have the answers for those yet. But some of the things that have brought us to now didn't exist 25 years ago as well. And so part of how we do that is to make sure that we're investing in research, as well as working with other organisations who are doing research as well. But also remembering when we do that farming in one country is completely different to farming in another country, even for the same commodity, and even different paddocks can be different. And so there needs to be the flexibility to not just do something in a lab, but how do you make sure that it works in particular local environments? And then how do you demonstrate it to farmers so that they can see the impact and understand what it does? So there's kind of layers in the research, for want of a better way of putting it. One is I guess I'll call it the laboratory, for want of a better way of doing it. Yep. Then there's the question of how do we small trial it in different locations. Pilot test to understand its applicability in different agronomic situations. And then there's the demonstration level, where we provide opportunities for farmers to actually see what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then scale, I suppose, as well.
It's where they bring it to scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about packaging, which was arguably the hot topic in 2019,
it's 2020. Still a hot topic.
I feel like the climate change is taking over a little bit more, but the packaging world. So you guys have been at the forefront of a lot of Australia's big packaging changes. There was the announcement of the 2025 National Packaging Targets, which you're one of the really early signatories for. You've been part of the ANZPAC journey. So I'm curious about how you guys communicate and approach talking about often quite complex topics, because the thing that comes to mind is your recent announcement of 90% recycled content on the front page of KitKat. Packtex, I've always said it's like the premium spot. How on earth did you manage to convince marketing teams to put 90% recycled content, which is a pretty
I think your question actually has a different answer to where you want to go. Okay. And that is that to make a change to sustainability in an organisation, it's not a group of people sitting over in a corner being, sustainability wonks. It's how you engage your entire business, and it's like you have got to pull levers right through the business. Yeah. And that means marketing has to be part of the journey. And our marketing teams want sustainability to be a competitive advantage. And they want to be first to market, as much as the sustainability people do. So it's the change the changes that have happened within the organisation to energise the organisation around sustainability topics, and to understand that the sustainability of your product, the emissions associated with it, the packaging, are as much a part of your planning as the P&L. So it really goes back to that internal piece. If you get that internal piece right, you don't need to convince the marketers.
So what about for any lonely sustainability managers out there who perhaps, don't have that energised culture, haven't managed to have that conversation with the Marcoms team? How do they practically go about changing that culture? What advice would you give them?
I'd say to get out there and talk to them. And like if we look out there, we can see that consumers, particularly younger consumers, want businesses to be doing something about climate change. They don't necessarily want to pay for it, but they want us to be doing something about it. That's our future market. And so if we're not speaking to where our future market is, where's our future? Nestlé's been around for 150 years. We want to be around for 150 more. That means we need to make sure we can source ingredients. That comes back to agriculture, in a sort of agriculture safe way, and to mitigate against the effects of climate change. But it also means we need to have consumers who want to buy our products. And so it's part of that. The question of complexity, that's a tough one in packaging. I think people are looking, sometimes it feels like people want a silver bullet, and there just is no silver bullet. Every packaging type has a trade-off somewhere along the way. From an environmental perspective, if not from a cost perspective, there are environmental trade-offs that we need to take into account and make sure that we get the right packaging for the right product.
I'm curious about your role in Oceania. So your remit isn't just Australia. You also speak to Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Pacific. What are the cultural considerations you take? What are the challenges that diverse role presents?
So I think perhaps the biggest challenge would be that we have two relatively wealthy countries, Australia and New Zealand, and a number of much poorer countries. And so what is right for Australia and New Zealand is not going to be right for the other countries. And even there are differences between them. The really key point is that we have people on the ground in those countries who help us understand that and get that right. You go to somewhere like Fiji. Fiji is as aware, if not more aware, of the impact of climate change and the impact of packaging than countries like Australia. If you're in Fiji, Fiji is an importer of packaged goods, and doesn't have the more sophisticated waste solutions that we have. Likewise, Papua New Guinea, they're not doing the manufacturing. We manufacture in Papua New Guinea, but overall they are importers of packaging. And likewise, somewhere like Fiji, they're acutely aware of the impact of climate change because they feel it so brutally. So same problems, but different way to approach them. And it's very much a matter of taking local advice.
You recently were part of a new resource, the Towards Circular Solutions Playbook. It was a project you developed in partnership with Coles as part of the Australian Climate Leaders Coalition. I'm curious about collaboration. I feel like businesses have to be willing to work with other people in the supply chain, with their competitors in a new way that probably wasn't happening 10 years ago.
So that's absolutely the case, because we've only got one planet, and we actually do need to work together. Because if you look at something like scopes, like emissions, for example, a supermarket, we are their scope 3, but also they are our scope 3 as well.
Yeah.
And so we need to work together to find solutions that scale, not to just protect our own precious patch. But if we find something that works, how do we bring others up with us or work together with others? Some of the work that we've done in systems for recycling is a really good example of that, because we can design recyclable packaging, but we don't have the scale as an organisation, we're not big enough to collect it or process it or any of those kind of things. So we need to work with others in industry to scale up both the volumes and to scale up the value chain to make sure that we've got holistic solutions. Now, the work that we did with the Climate Leaders Coalition is really important, because one of the issues that we face is many big companies have climate commitments. Larger companies have people focused on sustainability, but small and medium enterprises don't necessarily. And so the idea of the work that's being done by the Climate Leaders Coalition is how do we share what we've learned with organisations that don't have those resources so they can learn from them? How do we give them a toolkit of resources to help them on their own journey, whether it's reducing emissions, whether it's improving circularity? How do we do that in a sensible, joined up way for really the good of all?
And does Australia's competition regulations make that an easy thing to collaborate often with competitors? Is the market making that an easy process for you guys?
Competition law is obviously really important. It's always at the front of our minds when we meet with competitors. But by and large, sustainability work is pre-competitive. And so we're able to have those discussions and able to work together. It can get more complicated if you want to do something like a product stewardship, such as how do we bring coffee capsule recycling with our competitors. That becomes more complicated. But as a general thing, sustainability is often pre-competitive, but it's always wise to keep your lawyers close.
Yeah.
And I have to say, in our sustainability team, our legal counsel is as much a part of the team as anybody else to make sure that we get our settings right, both behind the scenes as we plan, when we're talking about it externally, and so on. We have to make sure that we're stitched up there as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Last but not least, your role's pretty broad, it's safe to say. What's the most enjoyable aspect and what's your biggest challenge?
The most enjoyable aspect and my biggest challenge, that actually feels like they're the same thing. The most enjoyable aspect is just how many things I get to work on. My day can involve talking about lollies, which can be just so much fun. It can be engaged in trying to tackle some of the problems of some of the worst things that people do to people when you think about human rights and modern slavery.
Yeah.
And when you think about the future of climate change and how we tackle that, how do we find more ways to reduce emissions? So the complexity and the breadth is what I find most enjoyable. What do I find most challenging? The complexity and the breadth. Trying to move everything everywhere all at once. But I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to do this.
I think that's a perfect place to end our discussion. Margaret, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Conversations in Sustainability, a podcast by the Green Horizon team. We're specialists in sustainability communications, from the circular economy to the energy transition and food waste to electric vehicles. We live and breathe these issues day in, day out. To check out our work and hear from some of our clients, head to greenhorizon.au.